people who are free are not equal, and people who are equal are not free. It's actually very interesting when you think about it. So I decided to make a video explaining why equality doesn't really exist and will never exist, and it's impossible to achieve. Now, that should be self-evident. If you look at a household with two identical twins, they're not going to have equal outcome. And even though they're born under the same family, even though they have the exact same culture, one of them is going to end up differently than the other. And if you can't have equality when it comes to identical twins, how can we expect to have equality when you're talking about a general population? Now, you can try to have equality under the law, which means that every single person should play by the same rules, every single person should have a chance to try, but you're never going to have equality of outcome. And I think I can prove to you why that's not the case. Let's say that we are visited by an alien population, and they look at Earth and they don't like the fact that people aren't equal. And they blame violence on the reason why people aren't equal. They say that because of wars, because of history, because of time that happened in the past, today some people have more than others. So what the aliens do, they use some technology that looks like magic to us to make it so that any human being who attacks another instantly dies. And because of self-preservation, violence just disappears from the face of the earth. No one is going to raise a hand at another human being again. Now, the aliens, what they do is they take up the earth and they share it in equal measures, in equal squares. And each person gets the exact same amount. Each person gets an equal plot of land. And let's assume, for the sake of utopia, that all of these squares are equal in all respects. They're just as fertile, they get the exact same amount of sunlight, they have the exact same temperature. So, 100% realistic, but for the sake of the experiment, let's assume that this is the case. No person has a more fertile plot of land than other. They have access to the exact same amount of water. You're not going to have a person that has a plot of land in a place where it doesn't rain, or a person that has the same plot of land in a place with drought. Okay, they're 100% equal. So as you notice in the system, you already have fascism. I mean, in order for this to happen, you require a strong fist to force people not to have conflict with one another, so free will is robbed. But more importantly, notice how people can just revert back to an agrarian society. I mean, equal doesn't necessarily mean that on the whole, people will be better off. It's a lot more simple to make people equal by making everyone worse off. Because at the end of the day, equality is what matters. And as long as not one person is better off than another or worse off than another, then equality is achieved. So let's look at what happens when the aliens leave. Let's say they're happy with what they did, what they accomplished, and they simply leave. So everyone has their little square, and they can't do anything to steal or to take or to force someone else to give their square. And now the individual decisions are the only thing that matters. So let's say you have this guy on square 1A, and he decides to have one child. The guy on square 2A decides to have no children, and the guy on the square 3A decides to have 5 children. So what's going to happen? Well, when this guy passes, his child is going to get the square. When this guy passes, there's now a square that is out of circulation. So he might actually sign a contract with other people and say, hey, in exchange for stuff, after I die, you get to have my square. And all of a sudden, another person, without doing any violence, without doing anything, just mutually agreement, is going to stop being equal. He's going to have more squares. Meanwhile, the guy that decides to have 5 kids, after he dies, well, those kids are going to either have 1/5 of the square, or maybe one kid doesn't get anything. And regardless of how they share the wealth, you will notice that just after one generation, you don't have equality anymore, based on people's individual choices. But let's look at another thing. So everyone has their own square. And that's what makes them equal. But they can choose to plan different things. They can choose to use the square for different things. So let's say some people decides to plant grain and other people decide to plant rice. And it just so happened that this year you have massive floods, and the people that wanted to plant grain end up with no crops, while the people who managed to plant rice, they end up with food. So what will happen is that even though they're all equal, their decisions are now affecting the output. Let's look at something else. Let's say that also everyone owns the same amount, but some people are strong and other people are old. Some people are able-bodied and some people aren't. And this has nothing to do with the way society functions. This has to do with biology. This has to do with the cards you are dealt with at birth. So what do you do then? I mean, a strong person can work his square, finish it before anyone else, and then he can quote-unquote sell his services to his neighbor. So after he finishes working his square, he can go towards his neighbor and say, hey, do you need any help? And the neighbor says, yeah. And the guy says, okay, I'll help you, but you need to give me some of the crops. So as you can see, even though, again, like they're equal, some people may not even be able to work the square. So what happens when they can't work the square? Well, they will have to hire someone to work it for them. And that person is going to ask for compensation. So when you look at the output, the person who works more because he's able-bodied or because he's not lazy, well, he's just going to have more stuff at the end. So yeah, everyone is equal, everyone has the same opportunity, but in reality, because of personal decisions and because of genetics and the way people are born, and some people might get sick one year and other people might be healthy and whatnot, you're not going to have the same outcome. And the most important factor here is how many kids you're going to have. Which means that the person who has a lot of kids are going to have to cut up the square into many different pieces until you're going to have people that don't have anything. And the people who don't have anything, because they can't be violent and they can't take it by force from other people, they're going to end up being slaves pretty much. They're going to end up being serfs. Other people are going to have a lot because of the decisions on how many kids they got. Like this guy, which only had one kid, the next generation, that kid is definitely going to have more than his neighbors. And if he also chooses to have one kid, then he can have a lot of land. And over time, you're going to have some people, again, without any violence, without anything like that, who own the majority of resources. And in this particular system, you're probably going to have the worst income inequality than out of any other system that was created throughout mankind. So the only way you can have equality is if you make people be robots. If you brainwash people, if you force them with an iron fist, and it's done by a benevolent entity like some aliens that genuinely want people to be equal, and they always remain on Earth, and whenever they see someone being unequal, they force them back into equality. That is the only way you can have equality, and honestly, that sounds like a nightmare. This sounds like the worst thing imaginable. I would rather have less than to have more and live under such a fascistic system. But hey, let me know what you guys think. Really interested in hearing from Marxists. And I'll hear you guys in the comment section. Take care.